Welcome back for another chess puzzle. For today's chess puzzle, we are looking for a mate in 3 moves for white. This puzzle is from the Netflix series Queen's Gambit, and it is a bit of a difficult puzzle, but I still want you to give it a try, pause the video, and see if you can find it. And even if you cannot find it, come back and we will solve it together. Good luck, mate in 3. Okay, so let's assess this position here. So black cannot move to many squares. In fact, he can only move to one square, and that is the g7 square, either with the king or with the bishop. Because the king cannot capture on f7, because the knight is doing a good job of protecting that bishop on f7. And of course, he cannot capture on g5 either, because the pawn is protecting the knight on g5. And the pawn on f5 is stuck. So we can only play either king to g7 or bishop to g7. So if we use a bit of imagination here and said if we could move any of our pieces to any square on the board to deliver checkmate, where would we place that piece on? So we would want to both check the king on f6 and cover the g7 square at the same time. Since these squares are dark squares, that means that the light squared bishop on f7 is out of the equation. So we are only looking at these knights. How can these knights, or where could these knights deliver a checkmate by covering both g7 and check the king on f6 at once? Well, there are two such squares. One would be on e8. A knight on e8 would check the king on f6 and cover on g7, cover the g7 square at the same time, which would be a checkmate. And the other square would be h5. A knight on h5 would check the king on f6 and cover the g7 square. Okay, so now we've identified which squares we want to go to. Now the question is, which knight do we want to move? Well, if we were to move the knight on g5 away, for example, say to h5, then, well, remember earlier I mentioned that this knight is doing a good job of protecting this bishop on f7. Well, if we were to move this knight away, then this bishop would be undefended, and black would be able to capture it and escape. So that is no bueno. This means that the knight that we want to move is the knight on b7. Perfect. So now we have found which piece we want to move. And we said that we wanted to move it to either e8 or h5 to deliver a checkmate. But which square should we move it to? Well, if we were to try to get the knight to h5, this would be one, two, three, 4 moves away. The h5 square is 4 moves away from the knight on b7, and this puzzle is asking for a mate in 3 moves. So that means that the square we could move this knight to is the e8 square, right? Because if we move it to d6 and then to e8, then we could get the knight to e8 within 3 moves. So here comes the next problem. So we have identified which piece we want to move and to which square. But the problem is our white king, our beloved king on d6, is stopping stopping the white knight from going to d6. So we have to move this king away to free up the square for the white knight on b7. So which of these 5 squares should the white king go to? Well, if we were to move it to, say, for example, c7, now black would have a new square to go to, and that is the e7 square. King e7, and the black king would now escape. If we were to play knight d6 as we planned, Well, if black, for example, would move back to f6, and we finally get our knight to e8, then this is not a mate anymore, because we let go of the e7 square. So black can escape. So that means we want our king on d6 to still protect the e7 square. So we don't want it to move it away from the e7 square. This means that if we play king d7, then we have freed up the square for the knight, and we're still defending the e7 square. Okay, well, let's say black play king g7 now. Now we continue with our plan, knight d6. And again, the idea was if the king is on f6, then we could achieve our dream by playing knight to e8, checkmate in 3 moves. And if black would instead play something else, let's say for example h6. Now, can you find the mate in 1 for white here? Well, it is not knight to e8 anymore. It is instead knight takes f5, checkmate. And all the squares is taken from the black king. Okay, so you cannot go to h6 either. What about f8? Can you find the mate in 1 for white here? Well, remember earlier I mentioned that this knight is doing a great job of defending the bishop on f7 and should not be moved away. Well, now with the knight on d6, it is now defending also the bishop on f7. This means that we can now move this knight away. The knight on g5, we can move it away and place it on e6, which would be a checkmate. All the squares are taken from the black king. Okay. So what if black instead play his other move? Instead of going to king to g7, what if he plays bishop to g7? Well then, we continue with our plan, knight to d6, the idea of still going to e8. Now, he cannot move his king anywhere. He can only move his bishop. If you were to move it back to h8, again, knight to e8, checkmate. If he were to move his bishop to h6, once again, knight to e8 is checkmate. And if he moves his bishop to f8, then knight to e8 is once again checkmate in 3 moves. There you go, that's the mate in 3. Did you find it? Or did you struggle? Did you find any of the ideas, but maybe not the complete solution? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.